There was a smell. You might not be able to name it right now, but the moment I describe it, something inside you is going to remember exactly what it felt like to be 8 years old in California. It was chalk dust, and old wood, and something warm from the mimeograph machine down the hall. It was the smell of school. And if you grew up in California in the 1960s, if you sat in those rooms, walked those sun-baked hallways, stood in that morning line with your hand over your heart, then you already know that what happened inside those walls was something that has never quite been replicated. Not the lessons, something deeper than the lessons. This is what school was like in 1960s California. California's schools in the 1960s didn't look like schools anywhere else in America. In Ohio or Michigan, schools were thick-walled brick fortresses built to keep the cold out. In California, they opened up. Wide breezeways between buildings, classrooms that looked out onto grass and blacktop, wooden bungalows that smelled faintly of sawdust even years after they were built. The architecture was a product of the state's post-war boom. Between 1950 and 1965, California built more new schools than any other state in the nation. The population was exploding. Families were arriving from everywhere, drawn by defense jobs and aerospace plants and the promise of a California life. They needed schools fast, so they built them simple, low, flat-roofed, stretched across wide lots in new suburban neighborhoods where the orange groves had been cleared just a few years before. The campuses themselves were enormous by the standards of the time. Wide blacktop play areas, grass fields that dried gold in late spring, drinking fountains mounted low on concrete posts dripping cold well water into the California heat. The flagpoles stood at the front of every campus, not as decoration, as a landmark. Every morning, children assembled around it, and every morning they stood still. The school day in 1960s California began the same way, every single day in every single school, from San Diego to Sacramento. You lined up. Not casually, in rows. Your class's row, your place in that row. The teachers walked the line and straightened it without saying much. A hand on a shoulder, a quiet look. The line became straight. Then the flag was raised, and every child put their right hand over their heart. I pledge allegiance. The words came out in that particular rhythm children use, slightly sing-song, slightly rushed at the middle parts, and then the line broke and you walked to your classroom door and waited to be let in. No one questioned this ritual. No one needed to explain it. It was simply what you did at the beginning of the day. The way brushing your teeth was what you did before bed. That was the invisible architecture at work. Not a lesson you were being taught, a habit you were being given. The difference between those two things is enormous, and it was the core operating principle of how those schools worked.
The classroom itself was a specific kind of environment that doesn't quite exist anymore. 30 desks, sometimes 32, all facing forward. The surface of each desk was slightly scarred, initials from previous years, the occasional groove from a pencil pressed too hard. You ran your fingers over those marks when the teacher's back was turned. The blackboard ran the length of the front wall, green, not black, despite the name. The teacher wrote on it every morning before students arrived, the date in the upper left corner, always in cursive, and the day's first assignment underneath. The chalk itself made a sound you can probably still hear right now if you close your eyes, that first hollow tap against the board, then the slightly chalky drag of letters being formed. The classroom smelled of chalk and old paper and something faintly institutional, floor wax maybe, or the particular mustiness of textbooks that had been stored in a closet all summer. The textbooks themselves were a kind of inheritance. Yours had been someone else's first, you could tell. There were names written inside the front cover, the previous users going back sometimes 6 or 7 years. You found yourself studying those names, wondering about the kids who had held this same book in 1958, in 1956. The maps on the wall showed a world that was still stable, or at least appeared to be. Africa had different borders than it would by the end of the decade. The Soviet Union was still a solid red mass across the top of the world. You learned to read a room by reading that classroom. You learned where to sit, when to speak, how to ask permission without embarrassing yourself or the teacher. These were not lessons in the curriculum, but they were absolutely lessons. The tools of learning in those years were almost entirely analog. Pencils, the fat kind in early grades, the standard yellow Dixon Ticonderoga by third grade. Rulers with metal edges that kids used to flick erasers across the room when no one was looking. Composition notebooks with that black and white marbled cover. The school library had a card catalog, rows of small wooden drawers, each one filled with typed index cards. To find a book you wanted, you had to go through the cards. You had to know the alphabet well. You had to be patient. Patience was not a virtue those schools preached. It was a mechanism they built into every single task. You could not skip to the answer. You had to go through the process, every time.
At 10 o'clock, a bell rang. Not electronically, a physical bell, or a buzzer, depending on the school. And every child in every room stood up from their desk in a burst of noise that had been compressed for 2 full hours, and the classroom door was opened, and they ran. Recess in 1960s California was genuinely unsupervised in a way that is almost impossible to understand now. A teacher stood at the edge of the blacktop. She was not managing the play, she was simply present, the way a lifeguard is present at a pool. Her job was not to organize the children's time. Her job was to be there if something went wrong. The children organized themselves. Foursquare was the California game. A court painted on the blacktop, a rubber playground ball, rules argued over and negotiated without adult intervention. There was a hierarchy to the squares. The back square was the king's position. You had to earn your way there. Tetherball, hopscotch chalked onto the blacktop by the girls who arrived early. A particular kind of tag played along the covered walkways that the teachers pretended not to see. Lunch came in a brown paper bag. For most children in California in the 1960s, the school lunch was what your mother packed that morning. A sandwich, peanut butter most likely, or bologna, wrapped in wax paper. An apple or a banana, slightly bruised from the trip in your school bag. A cookie, a thermos of milk or juice that was room temperature by noon. You sat at long tables in an outdoor covered area. You unwrapped your sandwich and you ate it, and you talked to whoever was sitting next to you. No one monitored the conversation. No one suggested a topic. You learned to talk to people. That's what lunch was for. Not officially, but that's what it was for. And then there were the teachers. There was a teacher, and if you went to school in California in the 1960s, you had a version of this teacher who never raised her voice. Not once, not in a year, not in the way you remember it. She didn't need to. She had something else, a quality that children recognized immediately, even if they had no language for it. A settled authority, a certainty about who she was and what was happening in her room. The room was her room. You were a guest in it, a welcome guest. She was not unkind, but the terms of your welcome were clear. The teachers of that generation had almost all come up through a particular kind of training. The California State Teachers Colleges in San Jose, Chico, Los Angeles, San Diego were producing tens of thousands of credentialed teachers every year through the 1950s and 60s to meet the population boom. They were trained in the craft of managing a classroom of 30 children with nothing but physical presence and earned attention. No behavioral management apps, no positive reinforcement systems loaded onto a tablet, just a person standing at the front of a room holding 30 children's focus through the force of their own competence. The discipline of that era was the thing people remember most clearly. The paddle in the principal's office was real. Most children never felt it, but everyone knew it was there. The threat was architectural, not personal. It wasn't about punishment. It was about the existence of a line, a real line, a line that didn't move. And here is what that line did for children that we have spent 60 years arguing about without quite agreeing on. It made the world feel predictable. Not safe, exactly. Predictable. The rules were known, the consequences were known. What was expected of you was known. And when everything about your world was knowable in that way, children could relax into learning, could stop spending mental energy on what might happen and start putting that energy into what was happening right now, at the desk, on the page, at the board.
California in the 1960s was not a single unified experience. The state was enormous and becoming more so. The diversity that California would become famous for was already present. Mexican-American families who had been in the Central Valley for generations, Japanese-American families rebuilding lives after the injustice of the internment camps, African-American families who had come west during the war to work in the shipyards and defense plants and stayed. The schools were still in the process of working out what integration meant. In practice, in the daily life of a campus. It was not seamless. It was not finished. But in the classrooms and on the playgrounds of California's public schools, something was being practiced, imperfectly, haltingly, but practiced, that the country was still fighting about in courtrooms and legislatures. Children learned to be California children. That was its own thing. The Spanish word for a street or a mountain was as normal as the English one. The Mexican lunch counter on the way to school was where you got your snack. The Japanese family down the street had kids in your class. California's schools were being asked to build something that had never quite been built before. And mostly, imperfectly, loudly, they were building it. At some point in the 1960s California school day, you were handed a wooden hall pass. It was heavier than it needed to be. It was always heavier than you expected. A flat piece of wood with the room number burned or painted onto it, worn smooth by thousands of previous hands. You held it going down the empty hallway to the bathroom. The hall was quiet in the middle of the day. Just the distant sound of 30 different classrooms doing 30 different things behind 30 different closed doors. Your footsteps on the linoleum, the hall pass in your hand. You were trusted with something in that moment. Not just a pass, a version of freedom. Small, bounded, temporary, but yours. That was the invisible curriculum at its most literal. You could be trusted with small freedoms if you had demonstrated that you understood the larger structure. The pass was the proof of that understanding. You carried it the way a journeyman carries his tools. The school library was a particular kind of silence. Not the silence of emptiness, the silence of held attention. Children at tables with books open, the librarian at her desk cataloging. The card catalog along the wall, its small brass handles worn bright from years of being pulled open and closed. To check out a book, you went to the pocket in the back cover, took out the card with the book's information on it, carried it to the librarian, and she stamped it with the return date, a physical stamp, a physical date. The book was yours for 2 weeks, and then it had to come back. No reminders, no alerts, just the date on the card. You were expected to remember. They were always expecting you to remember.
The last bell of the day rang at 3 o'clock, and every child in every California school did the same thing. They poured out through the double doors and into the afternoon light, and the volume of the world went from near silence to everything at once. Backpacks and lunch bags, and the particular noise of children who have been sitting still for 6 hours and have now been released. The smell of warm blacktop in the late afternoon sun. The school buses idling at the curb. And then, home. What those schools gave the children who went through them is not always easy to describe. Not the history lessons or the arithmetic, something underneath those things. The ability to sit inside a difficult task and not quit. The habit of waiting for your turn to speak. The knowledge, bone deep, not intellectual, that some things require patience and process and cannot be shortcut. The experience of being trusted with small responsibilities and discovering that you could carry them. These are not things you can download, not things you can swipe to. They are things that are built, slowly, over years, through repetition and structure, and the daily experience of showing up to something larger than yourself and being shaped by it. The schools of 1960s California were not perfect. No institution is. But they were building something real, something that is still inside every person who passed through those open-air breezeways, sat in those scarred wooden desks, walked those sun-baked hallways with a wooden hall pass in their hand. That smell in the hallway, the chalk dust and old paper, and the warmth off the mimeograph machine. You can smell it right now, can't you? Some things don't leave you. They just wait.